spend a lot of time talking about is the empathy deficit in this country, which is probably the biggest, most significant deficit that we have. And that empathy deficit, that ability to say, there but for the grace of God go I, and so as a consequence, I have to join up with those in need and lock arms and kick off my bedroom slippers and put on my marching shoes and get working on this. That's been absent among us, not just among them. You know, our dear friend Martha Minow, a wonderful professor here at Harvard Law School, used to love to say, and I don't know whether she originated this saying or cribbed it from somebody, but she said, in a lot of contexts, she'd say, some are to blame, all are responsible. Some are to blame, but all are responsible. And we've got responsibilities in addressing what has been happening in this country for far too long. Because none of this should have been a surprise. And so when I speak of shame, I'm not just ashamed of what somebody else is doing. I'm ashamed because I ask myself the question, am I doing enough? Am I doing as much as I could be doing to make sure that the festering sores of poverty and racism in this country are alleviated? And I'm not always sure when I look inside myself that I can absolutely answer yes. And that's the challenge, I think, for all of us coming out of a wonderful luncheon like this, is to ask ourselves that question. Are we doing everything we can? Or are we just doing some of what we can? And I was at a fundraiser last night talking to some Democrats, and they said, you know, you've got to give Bush a harder time. And I said, let me ask you a question. When you were writing all those checks in the Democratic convention last year, Democratic primary and then the general election, did once you write on that check, John Kerry, please talk about poverty? I mean, did you push the Democratic Party? Or were you one of those who said, no, we can't talk about that because that'll offend the middle class and it won't position us properly, and so we shouldn't be a witness to the injustice in our midst? That's a small example, but I think all of us can be reminded of that. Now, I don't have all the answers. I had lunch with dinner with my good friend Cassandra Butts last night, and I told her there are two things that keep me up at night. One is nuclear proliferation. In fact, when the problem of the levees breaking occurred, I was actually in London meeting with Tony Blair about issues of proliferation after taking a tour of Russia. Because when you see munition plants all across the globe, we went to a plant in the Ukraine where crate after crate after crate of munitions had been just left out in the open. Many of them then to be shipped later to fuel conflicts throughout sub-Saharan Africa. That keeps me up at night because I don't know what is it inside of all of us, what is it about the human animal that leads us to devote trillions of dollars to try to figure out how to kill each other. That troubles me. But the second thing that keeps me up at night is the image of those young men in New Orleans who were in the convention center, who, setting aside those who were finding food and water, setting aside those who were simply desperate, we must acknowledge there was a cohort in that convention center and in the Superdome, a cohort in the 9th Ward of New Orleans, a cohort in the south side of Chicago and Compton and Harlem, that we have lost, that is untethered to basic notions of fellow feeling towards other people. And there's something very deep, a big wound. And sometimes it keeps me up at night. I don't know exactly how it is that we go about healing it. It hurts me when I start thinking about it too deeply. I don't know how to save those young men. I don't know how to bring them back when they've gone that far. But I do have a couple of suggestions in terms of how I think politically we're going to have to move forward. First of all, just in the immediate aftermath of the hurricane, I think it's important that we don't just assume that George Bush is lying when he says he's finally been awakened to the fact of poverty and racism in our midst. It's tempting to do so, especially when he decides to put Karl Rove in charge of Reconstruction. But I think it is absolutely imperative that we call him on his bluff, that we assume the best, that we trust, although we should verify, and that we actively reach out to him and say, Mr. President, we believe, in fact, that those images were as disturbing to you as they were disturbing to us, because I will say that one of the heartening things about what happened over the last 2 weeks is to realize that the shame was not just in the African American community. Everybody felt ashamed. And we should take advantage of that impulse. And my plan is to reach out and to say to my Republican colleagues, let's get going. Let's get busy. And let's be open-minded about what works. Now, one of the problems and the reasons that we have not had the capacity to deal with issues of poverty in our midst is because we are so invested in ideological squabbling that we can't just step back and say, what works? If faith-based initiatives work, let's go with faith-based initiatives. Now, you've got to prove to me that it works, that this is not just a patronage system to buy off the black church, but, or to fund your Christian coalition. You've got to show me something, but I am willing to try anything that works. There's a certain pragmatism to what we need to do that I think is absolutely critical. And leaders under this tent can help promote that pragmatism. One of the ways I describe it is we have been caught up in what I consider to be a either-or mentality instead of a both-and mentality. Now, either the problems of poverty are because these folks are sick in some way and there's nothing that we can do about them and they have to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, or the problem is entirely one of the structural, systemic, institutional, racist ideologies of the ruling classes. And the fact of the matter is, it's, as Dr. King said, both and. You know, I've said this before, when I work on public school reform in Illinois or across the country, my attitude is we need more money in the schools, but those new dollars will not make a dime bit of difference if we don't have our children turn off the television set, put aside the video games, if parents aren't calling their teachers, if we don't overcome a core anti-intellectualism that exists within the African American community. It won't make any difference. It's both and, it's not either or. I have a lot of conversations about economic development in the inner city. And one of the things I do when I talk to the chambers of commerce in places like the South Side of Chicago, I say, listen, redlining is real. We've got to get more money into these communities. We've got to have greater public investment in infrastructure. But you know what would be a good economic development plan? Would be if folks stop throwing the garbage out the cars and the 40-ounce bottles, and if we just invested some pride in our own communities. That would make a difference. It's not either or, it's both and. And I think that general approach is one that we're going to have to marshal when we talk to the president. And all of us here are going to have to be a part of it.